This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the women's room where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. My guest today is Kathleen Wheeler, who is a co-founder of the emerging Ventura Climate Coalition. I asked Kathleen here today to tell us about the coalition and the process of putting it together, and also about the critical need for activists to work together and to act locally. We're so happy to have you here today, Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. It's an honor to be here.
Oh, well, I'm really happy to have you. So why do you feel it is so important to work collectively rather than individually toward getting us out of the climate crisis that we're in? Well, what can really be accomplished that can't be done by working alone? And why does working locally just make sense?
Well, both are important, but each has advantages. And collective action really has more reach. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Lincoln said that with public sentiment, nothing can fail, and without it, nothing can succeed. Our leaders don't create public sentiment. They respond to it. It's easier for them to ignore an individual than a group with many different voices, all raised, saying we want action. So the more people voices raised, the better. But the second reason is that it also, working with others, taps a diversity of thought and strength and experience that you can't really get working alone. And it makes it a more powerful movement. I think an analogy is that just as ecosystems thrive with biodiversity, so does the climate movement.
Okay. Now, is there a sense of urgency to mitigate the effects of climate change? I mean, do we have that 10 years we thought we had?
It's difficult to imagine how it could be more urgent. Name anything that you care about, and it's vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. For example, the economy, public health, national security, food, clean air and water, they're all affected. And I think what's most disturbing to me is that it is with the current levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we're getting things like the Kentucky tornadoes, the California wildfires and drought, the extreme weather events. That's with current levels, and those levels are rising. They're not declining. And if extreme weather events, and most disturbing to me, the loss of species aren't enough, climate change is considered the number one threat to the global economy. So it's extremely urgent, and acting with urgency is essential. The good news is that people are becoming more aware of the urgency.
Oh, good.
Number of Americans who are alarmed has grown by more than 50%, from 17% to 26% of the US population between 2015 and 2020. And those who are dismissive has declined. So overall, Americans are more worried, they're more engaged, and they're more supportive of climate solutions.
Oh, that's great to hear. Well, perhaps now might be a great time to talk about what happened when you moved back to Ventura 4 years ago. And did this experience help influence your decision to get more involved in climate change activism?
Thank you for your interest in that, Kathleen. I'm relatively new to activism. I stumbled onto this path just a few years ago when I retired, and starting with moving to Ventura on December 3rd, 2017. And many listeners will remember that it was on December 4th with the Thomas Fire.
Oh my gosh.
And although my concern for the environment started a long time ago, it's easy to forget about when you're in a climate controlled building, focusing completely on making a living. But it was ignited for me, no pun intended. when we were evacuated and spent the night in our car at the harbor, watching the fire spill over the hills in the distance right above our home.
Oh,
And although our home was spared, it did come within feet. A friend of mine, just a mile or two away, her home burned to the ground. And I tried to keep her in mind every time I wanted to complain about the toxic ash and the poor air quality that lasted for weeks. But it was a dramatic reminder for me that climate change is not in the future, it's here.
right. The fires and year-long fire season are an absolute indicator of climate change. Yeah, I find it hard to believe that anyone living in California can deny that the climate is changing and the droughts are causing unprecedented fires. I think most people want to do something to help, but they just don't know what to do. Do you see this as I do?
I agree with you, and I think it's a very important question. Let me answer it generally and then a little bit more specifically. First, I think it's important to keep educating oneself and then to spread your learning to others.
Oh,
With respect, not lecturing, but people tend to listen to others that they have relationships with and that they trust.
uh-huh.
And talking about it is important because even though 70% of Americans agree that it's happening and that it's serious, only 1 in 4 say that they talk about it with their family and friends. And with
Oh.
those numbers, I don't think that policymakers are going to pay much attention to it unless their constituents are. A lot of people want to know, what's the most impactful thing that I can do as an individual? And the answer to me is similar to that which you would respond to the question, what's the best workout program? Well, the answer is the one you will actually do, the thing you
Oh,
actually do.
you're right.
It's going to vary from person to person, what kinds of actions are selected. One of my favorite quotes comes from Shea Bastida. A vibrant, fair, and regenerative future is possible, not when thousands of people do climate activism perfectly, but when millions of people do the best that they can. 10 specific actions you can take that are on the greenamerica.org website. And the exciting thing to me is that number 1 on the list, eliminating food waste, is being helped right now by our city and by other places in the state with the kitchen scrap containers.
Oh, yeah. I'm so excited to get my container.
Really excited about that. That's a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. And we are being helped. We're being helped to make it easier, to alleviate our green guilt, and to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's also important to try to influence the bigger system with the way we vote, use our wallet, and the way we participate in the democratic process.
Uh-huh. Okay, well, those are some great suggestions. Now, you did a training with Al Gore's Climate Reality Project. How did it inform you to take action? And what about it really inspired you?
Thank you for asking that. It was actually, for me, a transformational experience. When I signed up for it, I wanted to be a better advocate for the environment. And I was alarmed by the depth of the crisis and the lack of a unified response that was equal to that severity. And I started the week feeling angry and kind of fighting despair, quite frankly. And at the end of the week, my sense of concern and urgency was the same, but I actually came away with something unexpected, and that was a sense of hope.
Oh,
And that's because what was offered there are examples of hopeful trends going on, both technologically and socially. And those trends suggest the possibility of reaching a social and cultural tipping point. Just as we're getting frighteningly frighteningly close to ecological tipping points, like the melting permafrost, and so on, we may be able to reach a social tipping point, which would mean acceleration.
Okay. So what do you mean by acceleration? The social tipping point, that people just really, everybody gets involved.
Right.
Right.
That people will move faster and with more urgency and make more demands as citizens. I think, humankind had an agricultural revolution and then an industrial revolution. We may be on the verge of a sustainability revolution. That's the hope. And I think crisis can bring us forward.
Okay. So acquaint your listener a little with your background in behavioral psychology and how you are combining these skills with the ones you acquired as a climate activist.
Full disclosure, I am not a scientist and I'm not a climate expert. My background is in the field of organizational psychology, which means applying behavioral psychology principles within organizations.
Oh.
And I worked for 40 years in the private sector with a variety of industries, from high tech to healthcare, utilities. And my job was helping people improve performance. And often that included developing ways to change the organization's culture. Why is that important? Because, as Peter Drucker said, culture will eat strategy for breakfast. A business has to make a major shift in its strategy, and the culture doesn't support it, it won't succeed. There's lots of examples of that. When I retired and moved, the couple who opened their home to us when we evacuated were in their 90s, and he was a retired employee of Jet Propulsion Laboratory, very interested in climate change, and his wife wanted him to get his thoughts down. So I offered to take dictation. Long story short, we collaborated on a lengthy essay called The Culture-Climate Connection. He opened my eyes to the science, and I offered kind of a different angle to writing about the climate, which was applying organizational culture change principles.
Okay, so what you want to do now with the the emerging Ventura Climate Coalition is to find a way to combine these skills to get people moving. So I think, first of all, so we can understand this better, that you should define culture for your purposes here for our listener. I know you said culture precedes policy. In other words, you've got to change that culture before you can change the policy. But what do you mean by the culture?
That's a great question. And it's a very squishy and abstract concept, culture. My favorite definition is simply how we get stuff done. Whether we're talking about the culture in our home or in the workplace or in the larger community, it's the decisions we make around food, energy, transportation, handling waste, and also how we interact to get things done. But let me just clarify, both are critical. Without policy, progress is not possible. But they're mutually reinforcing. The more policy changes, the faster the culture will follow. And the more the culture changes, the more
policy will be made.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. That's what I mean by a social cultural tipping point also.
Okay, so for example, if you want the culture to be more conservation minded, what do you have to clarify to the people who are in the culture?
It depends on where your culture change effort is directed. And I think of there being three domains. There's the culture in your own household, there's the culture in your place of work, and there's the culture in the bigger world, the community, the neighborhood, the country. There are all kinds of models of culture change in the business literature, but there are 5 principles common to all of them. And I think they apply to all 3 domains. You need a clear vision of the change that you want to make, what it will look like when it's done. And Catherine Hayhoe, climate scientist, says we need something other than, oh, you're going to take my truck and my cheeseburgers away. It's got to be a positive vision that pulls you forward. It might be, for example, at home, well, we're going to eat more plant-based, so we'll feel healthier, we'll save money, we'll feel proud because we're contributing to living sustainably. At work, it might be our reputation in the community as a socially responsible employer is going to be elevated. In the community, it might be we're going to lead the way and join other cities taking steps in the amount of actual reduction of climate greenhouse gases.
Oh, okay. Can we just leave it right there for a moment? We
Sure.
need to take a station ID. This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the women's room where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. I'm talking to Kathleen Wheeler, who is a co-founder of the emerging Ventura Climate Coalition. I asked Kathleen here today to tell us about the coalition, the long process of putting it together, and also about the critical need for activists to work together and to work locally. And we're back, and we were just talking about changing the culture. So I wonder if you could talk about identifying the power that you most want to influence. You term this as power mapping. Who do you want to most influence with your actions, and will this give you the highest payoff?
We want to influence those who are either in a position to make decisions impacting greenhouse gases here in Ventura and or influence others who are. For example, where local leaders have an impact at the state level. One of the ways that working collectively has helped is by tapping individual activists' prior experience. And we have accumulated, with the help of Jan Dietrich, who's a wonderful mentor, who are the climate champions among our city's leaders and who have further to go before they can be considered allies. It's like tracking the voting record of government representatives at the state and federal level, but more informal.
Okay. So now one of the ways you want to affect change is to target city council members who are in a position to change policy. What sorts of actions are you taking, or do you plan on taking, to get your message to them? So in other words, what does the activism of the coalition look like?
Well, building relationships sets the table, and we have started that process. While we're relatively new, we've had a few already where we call them lobby meetings, where we meet with members of council or of other organizations like the Ventura County Climate Emergency Council. And we also spend time educating ourselves, tracking the council agendas, learning about the issues. And then our intent is to scan those issues and then prepare talk points so that we keep the topic of climate action front and center as much as possible. We're also tapping the skills of a peer, Clint Fultz, in our Conejo Climate Coalition on how to build an internet presence, and we're excited about that. We're learning what other cities are doing to take action. Like one city has abolished any new gas station permits, as an example. LA has stopped new oil and gas permits. Those are examples that inspire and inform and let them know that they're not alone. We table at certain events, come and show up and talk it up. So those, and we sign on our support to various letters asking for things like drilling setbacks, shutting down dangerous gas infrastructure, that sort of thing.
Uh-huh. Well, in order to understand the immense problem of climate change, it's been important to find new ways of identifying and describing not only the perpetrators, but the consequences of their decisions and actions. Now, we hear the terms climate justice and environmental racism. What story do these terms tell us?
One of the things that was so inspirational to me about the climate reality training is seeing the need for the first time for an intersectional understanding of and approach to the crises facing us. There's no way to treat climate change as a technical problem in isolation from the mindset, some of it racist, that got us here. There's only one fight, and that is for the health of people in balance with nature. Here's an example of an interconnected solution to these interconnected crises. People who breathe dirty air near highways are more prone to illness, and 40% of goods move along those highways. So clean trucks are just one way to achieve a rapid and just transition to sustainability.
Oh.
It tackles both the problems of poverty and the problems of climate. And the Pope said it best. He said, the reason that some of these climate disasters haven't had more attention is because they're hitting the poor first. The solutions have to have everybody at the table. And I think that the movements, the social justice and the environmental movements, are converging in solidarity, recognizing that there really is only one fight.
Yeah, and the poor are obviously the least able to connect and to talk about their, the problems with the environment. I mean, nobody's listening, and they don't have the time either.
Exactly.
They're busy working. So here in Ventura County, are there examples of environmental racism caused by corporations that happen in the poor areas of the county?
I hasten to say that this is rarely, if ever, intentional, but I think that one of the recent efforts that movements within the county have converged on is the gas compressor station on the west side. That there have been multiple groups fighting that, asking for an environmental impact report, talking about the disproportionate impact on the citizens living there. That would be an example. Again, I don't think that there's a bad guy here. I think it's recognizing the impacts and acting quickly to do something about it.
Okay, that's good to hear. So let's talk a little bit about the Climate Coalition you're forming here in Ventura. How is it going? What sort of effort is needed to form a coalition and a grassroots action team? And I would imagine that you've had issues, false starts, dead ends, even setbacks. Do you have any startup stories for us?
Well, you're absolutely right. Just like any newly forming group, we've struggled at times to clarify our scope and our roles, and to make sure that everybody's voice is heard and get aligned around the priorities. Also building trust. Nobody wants to feel like an idiot in working together on a cause. And so we've had different points of view about, here's an example, how much time to spend on venting and on looking at the big picture of what's happening versus getting down to work on the local stuff. That's an example. And scope creep is always a challenge.
Okay, so what will the Ventura Climate Coalition look like when you're fully functioning? Well, how do you see it?
The vision is that Each person will be excited and clear about their role on specific projects that we've lined up, that we have processes in place, for example, that we can quickly turn around when there's an opportunity to speak up about something, that we have a very strong local presence. We're making presentations to various groups, and we're sparking the conversation and changing the conversation about climate. We're partnering with other environmental groups is also an important part of that vision. So all of those are things I see.
Okay, and knowing that you're not fully up and running, but you could talk a little bit about a few examples of lobbying that you've already done with the Ventura City Council and also the Thousand Oaks City Council when you acted in partnership with your sister coalition, the Ventura Climate Coalition.
We are hoping for a coordinated network across the county of city-focused teams that work independently and in collaboration. And an example of that is that Ventura Climate Coalition put out a request, and some of us were able to attend their city council staff in support of their sustainability division's climate, energy, and action plan. And I believe it made a difference. It showed that there was regional support and interest in this plan. And we signed petitions and letters as a coalition. We spoke out in support of REACH codes, which is building electrification.
Right.
And those would be a few examples.
Right. And they were into the REACH code has to do with phasing out natural gas over a period of time.
Right.
Okay. So what type of person would you like to see join this activism endeavor?
Anybody with a sincere interest in working toward a sustainable and carbon-free future, and who's willing to focus locally while also keeping current and informed on the national global scene. We want young, old, conservative, liberal, anything in between. Anybody who wants to be a part of climate and employment proofing our future. One just quick thing that I think is important to the movement is making sure that oil and gas workers are taken care of during the transition and not left high and dry, as an example.
Right. So we have just a little bit more time here, but I'm wondering what gives you hope on the days that existential despair makes you want to give up?
There's a couple of facts and figures that give me hope. I think the biggest thing that gives me hope is this possibility of a tipping point, that people are starting to talk about it. They are becoming more aware. I know COP26 was a mixed success, but it also laid the groundwork for the possibility. Here's a couple of facts. And 90% of new energy installed around the world last year was clean energy. That's gives me hope. Okay. We're not working in a vacuum. We're part of a larger movement. Those are the things that give me hope. My message to listeners is you don't have to be perfect and you don't have to be a zealot to care about what's happening in the natural world. And I hope you will find something that you can do and do it and take time to savor the world as well as trying to save it.
Okay, that's lovely. I need to ask you where your listeners can contact you to get more information.
They can get in touch at vcclimatehub@gmail.com.
vcclimatehub@gmail.com. Thank you so much, Kathleen Wheeler, co-founder of the emerging Ventura Climate Coalition, for coming in today to speak to our listeners about your experience in becoming a climate change activist who is directing her energies toward changing local policy. This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the women's room where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good.